Thank you for joining and welcome to BIOVIT Live. Today we are talking all about the complexities of ultra-processed foods with a really exciting expert panel. My name is Eimear. I'm a registered associate nutritionist and head of nutrition at BIOVIT, and I'm going to be hosting the panel discussion. So very soon we'll delve into the multifaceted issues surrounding ultra-processed foods, thinking about consumer perceptions, the food industry challenges, regulatory and safety considerations. But before we meet our panelists and get stuck in, I wanted to do a quick poll to understand sort of the consensus in the room today, and also just to get everyone sort of focused and in the zone of what we're talking about. So I'll launch a poll in a second, but I'll just go through the questions. So how do you perceive the role of ultra-processed foods in relation to health and nutrition? So there are 5 options there for you to choose which sort of resonates the most with you. Number 1, they are fundamentally unhealthy and should be avoided by all consumers. Number 2, they can be part of a healthy diet when consumed in moderation. Number 3, while not always ideal for health, they serve as an important convenient option in modern lifestyles. Number 4, the classification of ultra-processed foods oversimplifies their complexities and makes it difficult to draw meaningful conclusions. Number 5, none of the above. My perspective differs. So I'll just launch the poll now. But it's looking interesting. Quite a spread. So quite an equal distribution of choices on number 1, which is they are fundamentally unhealthy. Number 3, which was, while they're not always ideal, they are an important, convenient option. And number 4, that the classification oversimplifies them. So it's pretty even. So that's really interesting. And hopefully at the end of the webinar, it will be interesting to see if perspectives have changed at all. So let's move on to try and define ultra-processed foods for a bit of context. So there isn't a single definition for ultra-processed foods. The main thing that we have is the NOVA food classification, which breaks up all food into 4 categories. So the first category are our unprocessed, minimally processed sort of whole foods, things like fruits and veg, eggs, grains, pulses. Then we have group 2, which is the processed culinary ingredients. These are things that are used in very small amounts, so more like spices, salts, oils and fats and sugar, and they're usually added to the group 1 foods to make our group 3 and 4 foods. Group 3 is the processed foods. So these are made industrially using methods to help preserve them so that they last longer. So things like heat treatment, like canning, and also things like fermentation. So for example, tinned tuna, tomatoes, things like cheese. And then our NOVA group 4 is the ultra processed foods, and these are defined in this classification as processed foods that have undergone more significant levels of industrial processing. They tend to be higher in sugar, salt, and fat. So these are things like snack foods like protein bars, sweets, chocolate, also processed meats like hot dogs, ready meals, energy drinks, but then also even things like supermarket sliced bread. So a bit of a range there. This slide is just to highlight how much ultra-processed foods have really been a headline and how much of a popular topic this is. So on the left, we've got newspaper headlines. I gathered these all in just a couple of, they're all published in just a couple of weeks. So you can imagine the amount of headlines that are published in over sort of the course of a year. And there are some really fear-mongering titles in there, like UPFs linked to 10% higher death risk. So yeah, if you're reading the news, this is the sort of stuff that you're receiving. Then there's also a lot of non-fiction books available now for the general public to read. That top one, Ultra Processed People, is a really, really popular one. It's been in Amazon's top 20 bestsellers for 15 weeks on the trot. At this point, I checked that yesterday, so I'm sure it will be there for a while. And then the graph on the right is showing the amount of scientific publications that I searched for in PubMed using the search term ultra-processed foods across the years. And it just highlights sort of a huge spike in researching on this topic as well. So let's get into it. I'm really pleased to welcome our wonderful panel, and I'm going to do hopefully a lovely introduction to each of them now. So we've got Dr. Laura Wilkinson, who is an experimental psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Swansea University. Her research focuses on eating behaviour and weight management, with current projects exploring the impact of multi-component food items on eating behaviour. She is also involved in the Kaleidoscope initiative, which is looking at consumer acceptance of novel foods for healthier and more sustainable diets. So welcome, Laura. We also have Dr. Louise Neilson, who holds a PhD in food chemistry and is a seasoned food industry expert. As the cluster lead for the Nutri-Wales programme, she supports Welsh food and drink businesses with research and development and innovation. She also owns Twisted Orange, which is a consultancy for startups and small businesses, supporting with everything from brand management to supply chain expertise, and collaborates with Laura on the Kaleidoscope project, which sounds very exciting. And then we have Natalie, who is a registered nutritionist and exercise physiologist with over 20 years experience in nutrition research. She integrates her expertise in human nutrition and dietary planning with practical experience in lifestyle interventions and food regulation. Currently, she is the nutrition research lead for BIC Innovation and Nutri-Wales, and is a doctoral scholar at Swansea University researching ultra-processed foods and eating behaviour. So very, very relevant for today's discussion. And finally, Luigi, who is the Deputy Director at Safe Food Advocacy Europe, and a biologist with over 30 years experience in agri-food quality and safety assurance. He's worked in both research and lobbying at both national and European levels. And for Safe advocates for consumer health in EU food legislation, promoting policies that address health and environmental sustainability and food safety, whilst engaging also with EU-funded projects to enhance sustainable food environments. So I will stop sharing my screen now so that we can see our panel. And we've highlighted sort of the definition of UPF, so it would be great to talk a bit more about this and the health impacts. So Natalie, it'd be great to hear from you first. With how definitive do you think the evidence is that UPFs are detrimental to our health, and what the current research suggests?
Okay, so it's quite broad, but to try and kind of put it into a bit of a nutshell. So first of all, the UPF classification, if we're using NOVA, so there are other classifications, but NOVA is the one that's the most popular. It really is just kind of classifying things on the level of processing, not on health. So that's kind of where it came from. It wasn't evaluating, the nutritional profile of the food. It's just looking at the extent, and there's quite a crossover between all of them. So it was first coined in about 2009, but as you can see by your research and kind of graph, you can really see from about 2018, that's when things were kind of going ahead. Prior to this, we knew that things like reformulated food is a type 1 carcinogen, so we knew that that wasn't particularly beneficial to health. And we know that foods that are high fat, sugar, and salt, which already have a legislation, are also not particularly conducive to a healthy diet when eaten in volume. But particularly looking at ultra-processed food, there's been some really, really interesting research. There was a lot of it that's epidemiological, which I know Laura will vouch for, is really frustrating. It probably is a factor there, but we're also looking at people's lifestyles, people's overall diet, maybe their socioeconomic status. So a lot of those bits of research are really kind of saying it's quite detrimental to health. There's some quite interesting ones that have come out kind of 22 onwards. So we've got ones that particularly looked at Dutch consumers, and that came up with various different outcomes. Some of the different types of foods were showing to increase the risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus. Others didn't really have an effect, and some of the different foods were shown to kind of actually reduce people's prevalence of that. And then there's also a lot of conflictions. So Cordova did an excellent study. They were looking at all these different food groups, and they kind of came back and said actually breads weren't kind of increasing people's poor health outcomes, where again processed meats and other savoury goods, for example, were. And then there's a more recent one that's actually kind of just said that actually plant-based ultra-processed foods are I wouldn't say necessarily detrimental to health, but weren't conducive to health. So it's so mixed, it's so varied. So I think we really need to kind of start unpicking it. And that ultra-processed food category is so vast. It ranges from anything that is just kind of fits that category all the way to something very different. And I think one other point before I hand over is kind of we've got this big paradox at the moment where ultra-processed food is becoming quite demonized, for very different reasons. But also we're seeing a growth in a lot of foods that are ultra-processed, but with a health halo. So there's a little bit of confusion there, I think, as well, that's quite hard to unpick. And we don't know the long-term effects, really. I think there's much more research that's required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. And do you think the NOVA classification is very useful for consumers? Is that a useful system?
I don't necessarily think it's particularly useful. It's one of those things consumers have really resonated with. They've really picked up on it. I think it's really quite a catchy word. As I said, there's about 6 really good food classifications. NOVA's the one that was taken off. It wasn't necessarily implemented for consumers to take on board. It was more so to kind of give regulation and industry to kind of give a little bit of background. I think if it's a really hard thing, you want something that's simple enough so that people can understand it. But if you oversimplify it, it takes away all the nuances and all those really important parts. But on the other flip side, without the NOVA classification and without this research, there would be a massive gap. So we would really be missing it if we didn't have it. But I think it's opening a big can of worms that's going to keep us very busy for the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, very interesting. So I wondered if we could ask Luigi to talk a bit about any EU regulations around ultra-processed foods and how helpful they are for consumers making informed choices.
Many thanks, Eimear. I think there is no regulation about ultra-processed food in general. So, in general, the FIC regulation doesn't give so many opportunity to understand what is an ultra-processed food, even if you can read how many additives you have. What is clear is, first of all, is that NOVA system is not made for the consumers, it's made for the researchers. So when we talk about the NOVA, we are talking about something about the researchers are using. And I see that the most researchers in the world are using this. So probably is the right way to divide to the food. So the question is not if the NOVA is good for the consumer. It's not done for the consumer, so we don't care about it. What we see is that in general, the FIC regulation, the Food for Information for Consumers regulation, which is going to be changed probably with the next mandate of the Commission that is written in the policy, the first policies from von der Leyen. Is that the issue is that only any way that is impossible to read the back labeling where the list of ingredients is written, because the fonts are very small, too small, and you cannot read. And that's important also for all the novel food. I'm talking just a degree on regression on the novel food, because the novel food, when will be authorized, will be ingredients. So you will find in the back and not in the front. And if you don't want to eat it, it's very difficult to know. But in general, also the use of term of natural natural in EU, you can use this the term even if you use chemical additives. So you think that is natural, instead you are taking a lot of chemical additives. And last but not least, we have also now the issue with the plant-based. We have seen, I think that everybody knows the famous cream Nutella. Now in Italy, it arises that in the label they wrote is plant-based, good for vegans. I'm talking about something that in just a little spoon have 8 grams of sugar. So you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
in general, there is no it's not easy for the European consumers to have the right information, and that's it.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a minefield. And Safe obviously doing a lot of campaigns to try and raise awareness of these sorts of concerns. Can you share any insights to any campaigns that you've carried out or any that are upcoming?
Yes, we had made a lot of campaign, especially on the term of natural, for example. And we will have an annual conference in 19 of November. We will present a survey, a European survey on the perception, for the consumers on the word natural. And so we have made a lot of campaign about it, but also on the issues on the acrylamide, which is something that is produced during the cooking of some foods like potatoes or bread, pizza too. And we stressed, of course, the Commission, because there is no limit to how acrylamide to have in the European law, but we have also made just is an ongoing campaign to teach to the consumers how to reduce the acrylamide that they normally produce anyway when they are cooking their food in the kitchen. And last but not least, also something about the Nutri-Score, where we have shown to people and also to the Commission how in some parts could be misleading, and so should be not to be the right way, or you have to change those things and then have a new Nutri-Score. So, but normally we work a lot with the EFSA, so about the scientific risk, the risk assessment, and so maybe we can talk later.
Amazing. Very interesting. Yeah, the Nutri-Score is another another whole conversation we could have. Okay, brilliant. Now, it would be great to sort of turn the discussion a bit more to the consumer lens. And Laura, I know you've carried out lots of research in terms of consumer perceptions relating to ultra-processed foods, but also fortification. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about what you've done, your research, and also what some of the most surprising findings were.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, you know, first of all, consumers do perceive a kind of conflict between fortification of foods and their concern about processing, and expressed, you know, confusion about the decision making about whether to consume a fortified food because of that, even if they could really stand to benefit from that, you know, eating that particular food. But I think one of the things that we've kind of found surprising in some ways is that there is this benefit, this perception that we really need to be communicating with consumers about that potential health benefit. And what our data really shows is that consumers really want reassurance about taste and about the extent to which fortification will affect the taste profile of a food. And so, you know, we kind of suggest that actually we need to be not only doing that reassurance, but taking opportunities and finding ways to make a food still feel familiar to the consumer. And then also the other key consideration is always going to be price. And, you know, it's about flexing that price aspect with the other properties of the food, and you know, treating it almost as a bit of a push me, pull me type relationship. And really not taking for granted that people will pay a premium for a particular property of a food, but actually there's flexibility, and we actually found different flexibility around price across our different foods. So some of our foods had more flexibility around price than others. So it's definitely worth checking and not assuming when it comes to that trade-off that consumers make around price versus other properties of a food that may be health and nutrition related.
Really interesting, really interesting. And do you think that, or did you find that the perceptions on that price, but also sort of the wanting that reassurance, was sort of the same across different ages, demographic groups, or was it varied?
So it's funny because there's so much discussion culturally at the moment about how generations differ from each other. And I would say, even though we did find differences across age groups within our research, I would say that actually people are more similar than they are different overall.
Really, yeah.
But you know, some of the differences that we did see were, for example, some of those older adults were perhaps more concerned about potential functional benefits, such as digestive benefits and things like that, versus younger age groups who are a bit more concerned about those sort of health and fitness oriented benefits, versus our people undergoing perimenopause and menopause, who are particularly interested in benefits around things like fatigue. And so, but aside from those differences, there were also central similarities, and I think that's really helpful for us to understand, because actually, although we think about certain segments having particular needs in terms of fortification, actually we know that the whole population could really benefit from certain improvements in dietary quality. So that's helpful, thinking about that broad appeal.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very helpful to be able to appeal to a broader group. And I think the point about taste is really interesting. We can never do well with food products if they don't taste really good. Okay, considering all of this and the discussions about the different sort of classification systems about ultra processed foods and their use, how can we communicate these nuances in scientific research, in consumer research, to consumers, without sort of causing further confusion in their understanding of UPFs? And that's open to sort of the floor, but if Laura, you want to kick it off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think we need to do some work on the academic side, and to move us towards greater consensus, because, you know, it's really difficult to communicate a consensus to the consumer when we don't have a consensus in the first place. Yeah. And actually, for me, I think that really comes down to more interdisciplinary working. So as a psychologist, I often look at studies that are coming out at the moment and being talked about. And I think, it would be fantastic if there was more recognition of the psychology of the consumer in those studies, you know, thinking about what the food means to somebody in terms of those sensory characteristics, in terms of cultural context, because actually that might help us to explain why there are so many conflicts, because what we're looking for is we're looking to explain differences. And, you know, then we might have a much better chance of communicating them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, providing a bit more than sort of this black and white solution.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Does anyone want to add anything to that, or will...
Oh, I could just tip in just to say that there isn't actually a definition. So I think this is a really tricky, you know, how do we convey something when it doesn't have a formal definition? So in 2009, when it was first, the Nova system was established by Carlos Montero and his team, you know, it was very much kind of if it contained more than X amount of ingredients. And since then, it's kind of built on to being industrial processes, it packaged, which really could kind of, you know, begin to encompass most of the foods that we eat. So I think it's really hard to now go back and try and educate a consumer when we don't have this definition. There's been quite a few research studies, particularly from Swansea University, that asked industry experts as well as consumers to ask them to kind of rank which foods that they think are ultra-processed. And even the industry experts couldn't agree because there is such kind of loose definition. So I think we really need to kind of get that factored in, and then it will be easier then to start kind of communicating a little bit more. But I think we really need to start saying that within this massive category, there be a small percentage of foods that could really stand to benefit people. And perhaps there are ones that we need to kind of really treat as a treat.
Yeah.
If I may add something.
Yes, please.
Thank you. There are too many scientific papers that using the NOVA, of course, that say that the ultra-processed food, which are really full of additives, and the ultra-processed food are food that you start from something, you have another thing, okay? With an ultra-processed food, you can start from very poor very poor meat and have a cordon bleu with the fibers and vitamins and so on to say that it's sustainable too, because you can manage, okay, with additives whatever you want. So there are so many studies about it. The problem that the influence they have on the gut, on microbiome, on mental health, and we cannot wait for a definition. Okay, we need to do something now. So I understand everything, but what we are seeing in this period is that people is decrease the consume of fruit and vegetables and is going to plant-based ultra-processed food because are cheaper, are plant-based, so wonderful, but they don't know what they really are eating. So everything is right. We should try to find a definition. We can wait 5 years that the European Commission have a common definition discussing with the industry, but we have to do something now anyway.
Yeah, very valid point, and that leads me on quite nicely to Louise. With your sort of extensive experience in the food industry, what role does the food industry play, and are they doing enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult balance for the food industry. I mean, you split it down to private sector and public sector, but you know, at the end of the day, in the private sector, their drivers are shareholders, profitability, return on investment, and looking at plant-based as a market as an example. I mean, across Europe, it's nearly 6 billion euros now in value, and it's grown by a billion euros in 2 years. So the food industry is going to go, okay, I'm going to make products to fill that space. The retailers are going to provide that space. And I think, as you can see from that plant-based situation around convenience products, the consumer's now starting to get a little bit more inquisitive and trying to understand, yes, we want convenience, but is it good for us? And, you know, looking at trends across various surveys that have been carried out this year, you know, the trust in brands is declining significantly. They're questioning quality, they're questioning trust in sustainability. You know, what are the consumer benefits of these products? And they see that there's a lack of healthy, affordable solutions. And one of the key things that's really driving the consumer now that industry needs to focus on is, you know, the use of natural ingredients as being a key characteristic of products. So, you know, so it's difficult for the food industry because they do have to have that balance of, you know, existing and being viable as a business. But then on the public sector side, I think there's the opportunity to also do more, whether that be through policy in terms of legislating, specifying what kind of products can be on menus in hospitals and schools, and really working on the right areas. But again, that makes it's difficult for the public sector to then have due diligence around those, you know, policy contractual implementation that, you know, they just don't have the resource or the budget to be able to do that. So yeah, coming from the food industry, I can understand the dilemma of getting the balance right. And just thinking about when I worked developing products for M&S 25 years ago, we were challenged with only using cupboard ingredients, but then you've got quality issues, you've got shelf life issues. So, you know, it's difficult. I think they can do more. I think they should have more responsible strategies. They shouldn't just be focusing on sustainability. They should be focusing on health. And then if the consumers' confidence can build because they know that those brands are fundamentally providing healthier products, then they should marry up. The consumer should buy into those brands and the brand should benefit from that consumer buy-in. So.
Yeah. I guess it all links back to sort of that thing that we mentioned earlier in the trust from consumers. They need to trust the brands and the brands need to get out there and do the right thing. It's a bit of a feedback loop. Okay, really interesting. I guess in looking ahead for everyone, what do you think areas of research and development are most critical to advance public health with UPFs? Obviously, Luigi, you mentioned, you know, we don't just need to try and do a definition of a UPF, we need to do something. So should we be reformulating? What can we do?
Right. It's very difficult. We work as I told that we work a lot with the EFSA, so giving them scientific evidence in general. We also stay in the emerging risk group, and we have talked about ultra-processed food since 3 or 3 years ago. Of course, because should be an emerging risk. The issue is how you make the risk assessment, because as you see, the ultra-processed food are related to the gut, the microbiome. A microbiome is something that is very complicated. It's not is not an individual. It are individuals that are working together in our stomach. And so the approach of the risk assessment in this case is I don't use this word that I use. Is holistic. You have to consider everything because the microbiome produce also hormones, for example. So it's very complicated to make a risk assessment. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that everybody in the food chain has to work together, not only to try to protect the production that they done, of course, but trying to find technical solutions on it. Maybe find a way to reduce the additives, which are the main sources of this problem. So that's what I think we have to do at this time, and of course We can also try to find a common definition of ultra-processed food, but we have now to do something as food chain, okay, without waiting other things. As our friend said, it is a problem for the food industry. I know it very well, and so it's a problem that we could anyway have to solve together.
Yeah, amazing. And what else do we think needs to be the focus?
I think there's a handful of key focuses really. In the food industry, in the private sector, I think a lot of development is driven by marketeers. And I think having better interdisciplinary teams and really bringing in nutrition experts is fundamental to improving what's developed. And I think using the supply chain to enable that as well. So, you know, your supply chain's there to offer those ingredients that are going to deliver against healthy requirements. But at the same time, it all needs to be affordable. So, you know, if we are fortifying, it's got to be affordable. And I think innovation needs to really focus on scalability, on sourcing closer to home, and, you know, looking at the quality issues. You know, we were at a conference last week talking about the adulteration of ingredients coming in from different countries and the poor quality, and it's like you've got to really work with that supply chain to improve that. And I think the other key focus for me is just reducing that innovation risk. So, you know, as Laura said, we really need to understand the consumer in more depth. We need to not make assumptions. We need to understand what their key drivers are and how we can support them in making those behavioural changes. You know, convenience is always going to be here. They're always going to want convenience. They're never going to have enough time. So despite, you know, the ideal world of whole foods, you know, and, you know, more fruit and veg and more pulses, that's always going to be balanced by that convenience time issue. So anything we can do to drill down into that consumer understanding in more depth is just going to help R&D be more successful.
Yeah, totally agree. Natalie and Laura?
Yes, I kind of totally agree. I mean, kind of coming from my very purist nutrition and background, I would be the first person to say, absolutely not. People need to go and eat fresh fruits and vegetables. And these things are terrible. And actually, as you kind of get to really look into the complexities, there is plenty of these foods which really can stand to benefit people. It is about placement. I think there's a big gap between need and want, and we're seeing more and more nutritional deficiencies accompanied with obesity. So again, I think reformulation really is the key. I don't necessarily know if we need to shout about it. Sometimes some of this can be done pretty low key. Within the UK, when the HFFS ruling was come on, we can see that there was quite a lot of products which stepped up and they very quickly reformulated. But I think there needs to be quite a lot of research to make sure that if something is touting a benefit, that is really going to deliver a benefit. For example, we're seeing a lot of kind of foods out there that have added protein or added this, that, and the other, but we know that bioavailability or the quality isn't particularly great. So I think we need to really make sure that the foods that we're producing or reformulating will stand to benefit the consumer. And just by a consequence, the more reformulation we do, the more ultra processed foods there will be. So it's kind of like a bit of a cycle.
Yeah.
And then just following on from that, what I would really like to see it from the scientific literature is just a lot more specificity and focus on mechanism. You know, one of the most famous names in this area is, of course, Kevin Hall. And actually, Kevin Hall and Deirdre Tobias wrote a paper a number of years ago, really talking about the importance of understanding mechanism. And actually, that speaks a little bit to the point that Luigi made earlier about definition. Well, you know, if we have a lot of specificity and we understand drivers and mechanisms, do we really need this very, very broad brush, highly contentious categorical descriptor if we know kind of the very, very specific aspects and properties of a food that may or may not be affecting health, either for benefit or for worse? And then also the other thing about having that focus on specificity and mechanism is then that can lead to much more targeted reformulation, or you know, I've heard the word deformulation recently. So, but if we don't have that level of specificity and understanding of those mechanisms, then we can't do that. And we've heard from Louise and Natalie about how we need to think pragmatically. And so, you know, actually understanding and being able to reformulate is a potential way forward.
Yeah, really interesting points. Yeah. That's amazing. Okay, so I think we have some time for one or two questions. So if any attendees want to ask a question, there is a Q&A function along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Question about social media. What do you think, or what role do you think social media plays in shaping consumers' perceptions of ultra-processed foods? And this might be positively or negatively. Who wants to?
Shall I jump in, and then please feel free to all jump in too, because I could go off on a tangent. But I just think that there's a huge amount of misinformation. So I think social media can be excellent. It can be detrimental. There was a really interesting study that's probably a little bit out of date now that was done in 2018. And they found that those with large followings, so anything over about 10,000, were generally giving 90% of their information was misinformation.
Wow.
So and that was quite broad. So it could have been something that was slightly wrong to something that was quite misleading. So I think it's about actually where's that information coming from? You know, if it is a credible nutritionist or a doctor or a health expert. And I think then you have to dig a little bit deeper to make sure that they're not, you know, kind of getting some kind of financial incentive there as well. I think it's a really, really tricky area to kind of navigate. I think it'd be a fantastic platform. And if you have the right people that give aspirational, inspirational messaging, and it can really resonate with that particular audience at the moment, that could be a really excellent step of having fantastic education and changing the system. It could equally have detrimental consequences if it's misinformation. And I don't think that there's much regulation. So the ASA, so the Advertising Standards Agency, I don't even know where you'd begin if you kind of were working for them. It would be such a tricky place to kind of start navigating.
I think you can also use social media to get a handle on what consumers are asking and what they're not understanding. And there's apps now that are being developed that is scraping all of that data and then saying, actually, what do consumers want? And then driving it through to brand development. I think that it can be insightful. I think it could be really dangerous, because there are only certain demographics who are using social media. So, we've done a lot of work on healthy aging, and you could completely miss what that demographic would be interested in or want or don't understand. So I think it can play a role, but I think it's always with a pinch of salt or a pinch of seaweed, not salt, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's two sides to it, and if we can use it in a helpful way, then it could be amazing. But interesting thought about, who's actually on social media, what consumers are we actually reaching? It's quite a specific demographic. Okay, I think that's actually all we have time for. So I will just do a final few closing comments. So thank you so much for joining the webinar. I've really enjoyed it. I've found it super interesting. It's such an interesting topic, and we could have gone off on tangents for a long time, I think. So we've managed to stay in time well. Thank you so much to the panelists. All your comments were so insightful, really interesting discussion. And we're really looking forward to a next webinar, which will be all about children's food products and whether these are helping or hindering the nutrition and health of our future generation. We've got guests from different food companies in the children's food space, from the Collective and also Loon and Wild, and a few more to be confirmed. So you can sign up to our newsletter to find out about these will be launching the registration details very soon. So yeah, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining today, and have a lovely rest of the day.